The company parking lot was nearly empty, just a few yellow lights flickering overhead. Laura Bennett stood by the curb, her phone dead.
Could you please
Her
call a
voice
taxi for
tired
me?
as she turned to the colleague
It's
beside
late.
her.
Let me take you home instead.
Can you book me a taxi? She didn't know why Mark Reynolds, a single father who always kept his distance, let the words slip out. There's still room at my place. Both of them went silent in that awkward moment. But when no taxi came, the careless offer suddenly became a real choice. Would the safe boundary between two lonely people be crossed tonight? Mark Reynolds had never been the type to stay late at company events. He usually left early, citing his daughter as the reason, which was always true. But tonight, someone had convinced him to wait just a little longer. The party had been loud and chaotic. The kind of gathering where people drank too much and said things they wouldn't remember in the morning. He had nursed a single beer for most of the night, standing near the edge of conversations, nodding when appropriate, but never really joining in. Laura Bennett had been at the center of it all, not because she wanted to be, but because that's where people always seemed to pull her. She laughed at the right moments, raised her glass when toasts were made, and stayed until the music finally stopped. By the time the lights came back on, most of the crowd had already scattered. She found herself standing in the parking lot with a handful of stragglers, her coat pulled tight against the cold air. That's when she reached for her phone and realized it was dead. Mark was unlocking his car when he heard her voice behind him. "Can you book me a taxi?" She was looking at him with worn eyes, her tone casual but with an edge of urgency underneath. He turned and saw her standing there, phone in hand, the screen dark. For a moment, he considered just saying yes and pulling out his own phone. It would have been the easiest thing to do. But something in him shifted. Maybe it was the alcohol, or the late hour, and the words came out before he could stop them. "There's still room at my place." The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Laura blinked at him, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Mark felt his face go hot, the realization of what he had just said hitting him like a punch to the chest. He opened his mouth to take it back, to clarify, to say anything that would undo the last 5 seconds. "I didn't mean it like that," he said quickly, his voice stumbling over the words. "I just meant, I can call you a taxi. That's what I should have said." Laura didn't respond right away. She looked down at her phone, then back at him, her face unreadable. "Yeah," she said finally, her voice flat. "A taxi would be good." Mark pulled out his phone and opened the app, his fingers moving too fast, making mistakes he had to correct. He could feel her watching him, the awkwardness hanging in the air like smoke. He wanted to apologize again, to explain that he wasn't the kind of person who said things like that, but he knew it would only make it worse. The app loaded slowly, the little circle spinning on the screen as it searched for available drivers. Mark stared at it, willing it to hurry up, to give him something concrete to focus on besides the unbearable tension standing between them. Laura shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her arms crossed over her chest. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the empty parking lot, at the few remaining cars scattered under the dim lights, at anything that wasn't him. Mark had worked at the same company as Laura for almost 3 years, but he couldn't say he really knew her. They existed in the same general orbit, attending the same meetings, passing each other in hallways, exchanging polite greetings that never went beyond surface level. He knew she was good at her job, that people respected her, and that she kept her personal life private. That was about it. He had never thought much about her beyond that, had never needed to. But now, standing here in the cold with her phone dead and his mouth having betrayed him, he was acutely aware of how little he understood about the person in front of him. Laura, for her part, was trying very hard not to think about what had just happened. She told herself it was a mistake, a slip of the tongue, nothing more. Mark was known around the office as the quiet one, the single dad who always left on time to pick up his daughter. He wasn't the type to make moves on coworkers, especially not in a parking lot at midnight. She had seen him at these events before, always on the periphery, never drinking too much, never causing trouble. So why had he said that? And why was her heart beating faster than it should have been? The app finally loaded, and Mark tapped through the screens, entering her destination without asking. He assumed she lived somewhere in the city. Most people did. The screen showed a map with a handful of cars moving slowly along distant streets. None of them were nearby. He refreshed it once, then again. Still nothing. "It's looking," he said, more to fill the silence than anything else. Laura nodded but didn't say anything. She was staring at the ground now, her breath visible in the cold air. Minutes passed. The app continued to search. Mark checked it again, hoping for a miracle, but the result was the same. No drivers available. He considered calling a different service, but he had a feeling it wouldn't make a difference. It was late, it was a weeknight, and they were in a part of town that didn't see a lot of traffic after dark. "Still looking," he said again, his voice quieter this time. Laura let out a breath that might have been a sigh or just weariness. "It's fine," she said. "I can wait." But it wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The temperature was dropping, and the wind had picked up, cutting through their clothes with a sharpness that made standing still almost unbearable. Mark glanced at his watch. It was past midnight now, closer to 1 in the morning. His daughter was with a sitter, someone he trusted, but he didn't like being out this late. He never did. He looked at Laura again, saw the way she was hugging herself against the cold, and felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault. He thought about offering again, about saying it more carefully this time, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The first attempt had been disastrous enough, so instead he just stood there, phone in hand, watching the app spin and search and find nothing. Laura must have been thinking the same thing because she finally broke the silence. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll be fine." Mark shook his head. "I'm not leaving you out here alone." It came out more forcefully than he intended, and Laura looked at him with something that might have been surprise. They fell into another silence, this one less awkward, but no less uncomfortable. Mark kept refreshing the app, hoping for a different result, while Laura stood a few feet away, her arms still crossed, her face unreadable. The parking lot felt impossibly large and empty around them, the kind of place that seemed designed to make people feel small. A car passed on the street beyond, its headlights sweeping across the pavement before disappearing into the night. Neither of them moved. Mark thought about his daughter, tucked safely at home with Miss Amy, the babysitter who had watched her since she was 3. He thought about his apartment, quiet and warm, and the couch where he would collapse as soon as he got home. He thought about how much easier his life had been when he kept to himself, when he didn't let moments like this happen. But here he was, standing in a freezing parking lot with a woman he barely knew, waiting for a taxi that might never come. Laura thought about her own apartment, small and empty, the kind of place that felt lonelier the longer you stayed in it. She thought about the last few months, the heaviness that had settled into her bones, the feeling that nothing she did was ever quite enough. She thought about the party they had just left, the forced smiles and shallow conversations, and how relieved she had been when it was finally over. And now this strange, uncomfortable limbo with a man who had said something he clearly regretted and couldn't seem to move past. The app refreshed again. Still nothing. Mark let out a breath and looked up at the sky, searching for something he couldn't name. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low, "for what I said before. That was stupid." Laura glanced at him, her expression softening just a fraction. "It's okay," she said. "You didn't mean anything by it." He nodded, grateful for the reprieve, But the weight of the moment didn't lift. If anything, it felt heavier now, like something had shifted between them that couldn't be undone. Another few minutes passed. The cold was becoming unbearable. Mark could see Laura shivering now, her breath coming in short clouds. He checked the app one more time, already knowing what he would find. Nothing. No cars. No hope. He closed his eyes and made a decision he knew he would regret. "There's still room at my place," he said again, his voice steady this time, deliberate. Laura's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What?" Mark met her gaze and didn't look away. "I know how that sounds, but I live 10 minutes from here. And I'm not alone. My daughter's there. I just meant you could wait somewhere warm until a taxi shows up in the morning." Laura stared at him, her mind racing. This was insane. This was crossing a line she had never even considered crossing. But the alternative was standing here in the freezing cold for who knew how long, hoping a car would eventually show up. She looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw nothing but weariness and sincerity. He wasn't trying to take advantage. He was just trying to help. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice uncertain. Mark nodded. "I get it. But the offer's there if you need it." He didn't push. He just stood there, waiting, his phone still in his hand. Laura looked down at her own dead phone, then back at the empty parking lot. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the ways this could go wrong. But she also thought about how bone deep her fatigue ran, how cold, and how much she didn't want to be alone right now. "Okay," she said, the word barely audible. Mark's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to agree. "Okay," he repeated. And just like that, the decision was made. The drive was quiet. Mark kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Laura sat in the passenger seat, her coat still pulled around her, staring out the window at the empty street sliding past. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who had just made a decision they weren't entirely sure about, and were now living with the consequences. Mark's apartment was in a low-rise building on the edge of a residential neighborhood, the kind of place that looked weathered, but functional. He pulled into a parking spot near the entrance and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Laura looked at the building, then back at him. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice careful. Mark nodded. "Yeah, it's fine, really." He got out of the car, and she followed, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was still giving herself a chance to change her mind. The lobby was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead. Mark led the way to the elevator, pressing the button for the 4th floor. They rode up in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the machinery. Laura kept her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the glowing numbers above the door. She could feel her heart beating faster than it should have been, a low hum of anxiety she couldn't quite shake. This was a mistake. She knew it was a mistake, but she also knew she was too drained to care. Mark unlocked the door to his apartment and stepped inside, flipping on a light. The place was small but clean, the kind of space that felt lived in without being cluttered. A couch sat against one wall, a coffee table in front of it covered with a few scattered toys. A pair of small shoes sat neatly by the door. Laura stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place suddenly louder than she expected. Mark gestured toward the couch. "You can sit. I'll get you some water or something." Laura sat down, her body sinking into the cushions. She looked around the room, taking in the details. There was a framed picture on a shelf, a little girl with dark hair and a wide smile. Another photo showed Mark and the same girl at a park, both of them laughing. The apartment didn't feel like a bachelor pad. It felt like a home, something she hadn't expected. Mark returned with a glass of water and set it on the table in front of her. "Thanks," she said quietly. He nodded and sat down in the chair across from her, leaving a careful distance between them. The awkwardness was back now, heavier than before. Laura took a sip of water, more to have something to do with her hands than because she was thirsty. Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the floor. "My daughter's asleep," he said after a moment. "Her room's down the hall. She sleeps pretty soundly, so you don't have to worry about waking her up or anything." Laura nodded. "How old is she?" Mark looked up, a faint smile crossing his face. 6. Just started first grade." There was a softness in his voice when he talked about her, something that made him seem less guarded. Laura set the glass down and leaned back against the couch. "You don't talk about her much at work." Mark shrugged. "I don't talk much at work in general." That was true. And they both knew it. He had always been the quiet one, the person who kept to himself and didn't get involved in office politics or drama. Laura had respected that about him, even if she didn't understand it. "Why'd you stay tonight?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard, and he looked at her with something like confusion. "At the party," she clarified. "You never stay late." Mark thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know. Someone convinced me it would be good to stick around. Said I should try to be more social." He let out a dry laugh. "Guess that worked out great." Laura didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased a little. "Yeah, real great." They fell into another silence, this one softer, less jagged. The apartment was warm, almost too warm after the freezing parking lot. Laura felt the weariness creeping back in, her body begging for sleep. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to rest them, and when she opened them again, Mark was watching her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Laura nodded. "Just beat." Mark stood up and grabbed a blanket from a basket near the couch. He handed it to her, his movements careful, deliberate. "You can sleep here if you want. I'll call you a taxi first thing in the morning. Should be easier to get one then." Laura took the blanket, her fingers brushing against his for just a second. "What about you?" Mark gestured toward the hallway. "I'll be in my room. Door's open if you need anything." Laura looked at him, searching his face for something she couldn't name. There was no agenda in his eyes, no hidden motive. He was just a worn-out man trying to do the right thing. She nodded slowly. "Okay." Mark turned to leave, then stopped at the edge of the hallway. "Laura," he said, his voice hesitant. She looked up at him. I wouldn't. This isn't like that." He was struggling to find the words, his face flushed. Laura held up a hand. "I know," she said simply. "I know." He nodded, relief washing over his features, and disappeared down the hallway. Laura sat there for a long time, the blanket draped over her lap, staring at the wall. She wondered how she had ended up here, in a stranger's apartment in the middle of the night, and questioned if she had lost her mind. But the apartment was quiet and warm, and for the first time in hours, she didn't feel like she was about to collapse. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and lay down on the couch, her body finally relaxing. Sleep came faster than she expected, pulling her under before she could think too much about what tomorrow would bring. Mark stood in the hallway outside his daughter's room, listening to the soft sound of her breathing through the cracked door. She was curled up under her blankets, her stuffed rabbit clutched in one arm. Miss Amy had texted him earlier, confirming she had put her to bed on time and left just before 11. He watched her for a moment, the familiar ache of love and responsibility settling over him like a weight. This was why he didn't do things like this. This was why he kept his distance, why he didn't get involved. Because his life wasn't just his anymore. Every decision he made affected her, and he couldn't afford to mess that up. He closed the door gently and walked back to his own room. leaving the door open like he had promised. He sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of the night. He had invited a coworker to his apartment, a woman he barely knew. And now she was sleeping on his couch. If someone had told him this morning that this was how his evening would end, he would have laughed. But here he was, and there was no taking it back. Mark noticed Laura's phone on the coffee table where she had left it. He walked quietly back to the living room, careful not to wake her, and picked it up. He found a charging cable in the kitchen drawer and plugged it in on the counter, making sure the screen lit up to show it was charging. He set it down gently and returned to his room. Mark lay down on his bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the faint sound of Laura shifting on the couch in the other room, the creak of the cushions as she settled in. He wondered what she was thinking, if she regretted agreeing to come here, if she trusted him at all. He hoped she did. He hoped she understood that he wasn't trying to complicate things, that he was just trying to help. But he also knew that intentions didn't always matter. People saw what they wanted to see, and tomorrow, when the sun came up, everything would look different. Sleep didn't come easily. Mark lay there for what felt like hours, his mind cycling through every possible outcome of this situation. He wondered what people at work would say if they found out. He wondered how Laura might interpret this, how it might change the way she looked at him. He considered what his daughter might think if she woke early and came out to find someone sleeping on their couch. He should have thought all of this through before he opened his mouth, but he hadn't, and now he was stuck with the consequences. In the living room, Laura was having her own crisis. She had woken up once, disoriented, her heart racing as she tried to remember where she was. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp Mark had left on in the kitchen. She sat up, the blanket falling away, and looked around. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She considered getting up, calling someone, leaving. But her phone was still dead, and she had no idea where she would go. She lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling. This was insane. She barely knew this man. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe that this was anything other than a terrible idea. But he had a daughter. She had seen the pictures, heard the way he talked about her. That had to mean something, didn't it? People with kids didn't do stupid things. They couldn't afford to. She held on to that thought like a lifeline, hoping it was enough. The hours dragged on. Laura drifted in and out of sleep, her mind never fully settling. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the street outside, pulled her back to wakefulness. She wondered if Mark was asleep, or if he was lying awake in his room, regretting everything just as much as she was. She wondered if his daughter would wake up early, if she would ask questions, if this whole situation would unravel before the sun even came up. Mark finally gave up on sleep around 5 in the morning. He got out of bed and walked quietly to the kitchen, careful not to wake Laura. He filled a glass with water and stood by the window, looking out at the city as it began to wake up. The sky was still dark, but there was a faint line of light on the horizon, the promise of a new day. He considered calling a taxi now, waking Laura up and getting her out of here before his daughter woke up. But that felt wrong, too rushed, too cold. He set the glass down and leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't know what the right move was anymore. He had done what he thought was the decent thing, but now he was second-guessing everything. Maybe he should have just let her wait in the parking lot. Maybe he should have called her a different service, tried harder to find a solution that didn't involve bringing her here. But it was too late for that now. The decision had been made, and all he could do was see it through. Laura woke up for good around 6. The room was lighter now, the early morning sun filtering through the curtains. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on the couch. She could hear movement in the kitchen, the sound of someone making coffee. She stood up and folded the blanket, setting it neatly on the armrest. She felt strange, out of place, like she had walked into someone else's life and didn't belong there. She took a deep breath and walked toward the kitchen. Mark looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Laura nodded. "Morning." He gestured to the coffee pot. "Want some?" She shook her head. "I'm okay. Thanks." They stood there for a moment, the awkwardness from the night before still lingering between them. Mark pulled out his phone and opened the taxi app. "Let me call you that ride." Laura watched as he tapped through the screens, her heart sinking a little at the thought of leaving. Not because she wanted to stay, but because she didn't know what came next. The app showed several cars nearby, a stark contrast to the empty map from the night before. Mark selected one and confirmed the pickup. "Should be here in about 10 minutes, he said. Laura nodded. "Okay." She looked around the apartment one more time, her eyes landing on the hallway that led to the bedrooms. "Your daughter," she said quietly. "She didn't wake up, did she?" Mark shook his head. "No, she's still asleep. She usually doesn't get up until 7. Laura felt a strange sense of relief at that, though she couldn't quite explain why. They walked to the door together, the silence between them heavy but not unbearable. Mark picked up her phone from the counter where it had been charging overnight. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing it to her. Laura took it, the small gesture hitting her harder than it should have. The screen showed a full battery. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer than she intended. Mark opened the door, and they stepped into the hallway. The building was quiet, most of the residents still asleep. They rode the elevator down in silence, both of them staring at the numbers above the door. The taxi was waiting outside when they reached the lobby. Mark walked her to the car, his hands shoved in his pockets. Laura turned to face him before getting in. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate, "for not leaving me out there." Mark shrugged, his expression unreadable. "It's fine. Anyone would have done the same." Laura didn't think that was true, but she didn't argue. She opened the car door and slid into the back seat. Mark stepped back, giving her space. "See you at work," he said. Laura nodded. "Yeah. See ya." The car pulled away, and Laura watched through the window as Mark stood there, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared from view. She leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. She didn't know what it meant, if it meant anything at all. But something had shifted between them, something she couldn't quite name. And as the city woke up around her, bathed in the soft light of morning, she realized that maybe, just maybe, safety didn't always come from keeping people at a distance. Sometimes it came from letting them in, even when it scared you. Laura didn't go straight home. She had the driver take her to a coffee shop a few blocks from her apartment, a place that opened early for the morning commuters. She needed time to think, to process what had just happened before she walked back into her own life. The shop was nearly empty, just a handful of people hunched over laptops or staring at their phones. She ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching the city come to life outside. Her phone buzzed on the table, a text from her sister asking how the party had been. Laura stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out how to answer. What could she say? That she had spent the night at a coworker's apartment because her phone died and there were no taxis? That she had slept on his couch while his daughter slept down the hall? That nothing had happened, but somehow everything felt different now? She typed out a quick reply. "It was fine. Talk later." She set the phone down and wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Mark was still standing outside his building when the taxi disappeared around the corner. He stood there longer than he needed to, his mind replaying the last 12 hours in fractured pieces. He had done the right thing. He was sure of that. But the right thing didn't always feel clean, and this whole situation felt messy in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He turned and walked back inside, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the extra time before he had to face his daughter. She was awake when he got back to the apartment, sitting on the floor in her pajamas, surrounded by her toys. She looked up when he came in, her face lighting up the way it always did. "Daddy, you're home." Mark smiled, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "Yeah, baby. I'm home." She held up a plastic dinosaur. "Can we have pancakes?" Mark nodded. "Sure. Give me a few minutes." He walked to the kitchen and started pulling out ingredients, grateful for the familiar routine. As he mixed the batter, his daughter climbed onto a stool at the counter, watching him with curious eyes. "Did you have fun at your party?" she asked. Mark glanced at her, then back at the bowl. "It was okay, just work stuff." She nodded like she understood, even though she probably didn't. "Miss Amy said you came home really late." Mark kept stirring, his movements steady. "Yeah, it ran longer than I thought." His daughter kicked her feet against the stool. "Did you make any new friends?" The question caught him off guard, and he looked at her, really looked at her. "Maybe," he said finally. "I'm not sure yet." Laura went home eventually, the coffee doing little to settle her nerves. Her apartment felt too quiet, too empty, the kind of space that magnified loneliness instead of offering comfort. She dropped her bag by the door and walked straight to the bathroom, turning on the shower and standing under the hot water until her skin turned red. She kept replaying the way Mark had looked at her in the parking lot, the hesitation in his voice when he offered his apartment. She kept thinking about the blanket he had given her, the coffee pot he had turned on before she woke up, the phone he had charged without asking. She got dressed and sat on her bed, her hair still wet, staring at nothing. She had spent so long building walls around herself, keeping people at arm's length, convinced that independence was the same thing as strength. But last night, standing in that freezing parking lot, she had been forced to accept help from someone she barely knew, and he had given it without expecting anything in return. That shouldn't have been surprising. People helped each other all the time. But it felt surprising, and that realization made her uncomfortable in ways she didn't want to examine. Mark dropped his daughter off at school and went straight to work. He was early, earlier than usual. But he couldn't stand the thought of sitting in his apartment with his own thoughts. The office was still mostly empty, just a few people at their desks, nursing their own coffee and staring at screens. He sat down at his desk and turned on his computer, trying to focus on the pile of emails waiting for him. But his mind kept drifting back to the night before, to the look on Laura's face when she got into the taxi, to the way she had said, "Thank you," like it meant something more. Laura arrived at the office an hour later. She had considered calling in sick, but that felt like running away, and she was done with running. She walked through the hallways with her head down, avoiding eye contact, hoping no one would ask about the party. Most people didn't. They were too absorbed in their own mornings, their own problems. She made it to her desk without incident and sat down, her hands shaking just a little as she logged into her computer. She didn't see Mark until lunchtime. She was in the break room, microwaving leftovers, when he walked in. They made eye contact across the room, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then Mark nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and Laura nodded back. He grabbed a coffee from the machine and left without saying anything. It wasn't much, but it was enough. An acknowledgement that they had shared something, that it hadn't been erased just because the sun had come up. The days that followed were strange. Laura and Mark didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't need to, but something had shifted in the way they moved around each other. When they passed in the hallway, there was a flicker of recognition that hadn't been there before. When they sat in the same meeting, there was a quiet understanding, an awareness that they were no longer just distant co-workers occupying the same space. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. A week later, Laura found herself in the break room at the same time as Mark again. This time, she didn't look away. "Hey," she said, her voice casual. Mark looked up from his coffee. "Hey." They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Then Laura spoke again. "I never really thanked you. For that night." Mark shook his head. "You don't have to." Laura nodded slowly. "I know, but I wanted to." Mark looked at her, something softening in his expression. "You would have done the same." Laura considered that. "Maybe." "I'd like to think so." They fell into a routine after that. Not a close friendship, but something steadier than what they'd had before. They ate lunch together sometimes, not every day, but enough that people started to notice. They talked about work, about their lives in the kind of surface-level way that felt safe. Mark told her about his daughter, about the challenges of raising a kid on his own. Laura told him about her sister, about the pressure she felt to have everything figured out. It wasn't deep, but it was real, and that was more than either of them had expected. One afternoon, a few weeks after the night in the parking lot, Laura was walking to her car when she saw Mark loading groceries into his trunk. His daughter was with him, bouncing around in a bright pink jacket, chattering about something Laura couldn't hear. Mark looked up and saw her standing there. He waved, and she waved back. His daughter noticed and tugged on his sleeve. "Who's that?" Laura could see Mark lean down to say something, and then the little girl waved too, her smile wide and uninhibited. Laura felt something catch in her chest, something warm and unexpected. She got in her car and sat there for a moment, her hands on the wheel. She reflected on the night that had started all of this, the panic she had felt standing in that empty parking lot, the fear of being vulnerable, of needing help. She thought about Mark's awkward offer, the way he had stumbled over his words, the way he had opened his home without asking for anything in return. She thought about the walls she had built around herself, and how, for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel quite so necessary. Mark watched Laura drive away, his daughter still chattering beside him. "She's nice," his daughter said, her voice matter of fact. Mark smiled. "Yeah, she is." His daughter climbed into the car, and Mark followed, buckling her in before getting into the driver's seat. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he considered how easy it would have been to leave Laura standing there that night, how much simpler his life would be if he had just called the taxi and driven away. But he hadn't, and now his life was a little more complicated. And somehow, that didn't feel like a bad thing. Laura went home that night and sat on her couch, the same couch where she had spent so many evenings alone. But tonight, the loneliness didn't feel as heavy. She thought about the way Mark had waved, the way his daughter had smiled at her, the way it felt to be seen by people who didn't expect anything from her. She thought about the night in his apartment, the awkwardness and the fear, and how none of it had ended the way she thought it would. She thought about trust, about how hard it was to give and how easy it was to lose. The next morning, Laura stopped by Mark's desk before the day officially started. He looked up, surprised. "Morning," he said. Laura held out a coffee cup. "Thought you might need this." Mark took it, his eyes widening slightly. "Thanks," Laura shrugged. "You charged my phone. Figured I owed you." Mark smiled, a real smile, and Laura felt something settle inside her. They didn't need to talk about that night. They didn't need to dissect it or analyze it or turn it into something it wasn't. It had happened, and it had changed them, and that was enough. As Laura walked back to her desk, she realized something she hadn't let herself admit before. Safety didn't come from being alone. It didn't come from keeping people at a distance or building walls so high that no one could climb them. Safety came from choosing to trust, even when it was terrifying. It came from accepting help when you needed it and offering help when you could. It came from people who kept their promises, who respected boundaries, and who chose kindness even when it was inconvenient. Mark sat at his desk, the coffee still warm in his hands. and reflected on the night that had started all of this. He had been so afraid of crossing a line, of being misunderstood, of making a mistake that would follow him. But the line hadn't been crossed. The boundaries had held. And in the space between what could have happened and what did happen, something better had emerged. Something built on respect and trust, and the quiet realization that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let someone in. The story didn't end with a grand gesture or a dramatic confession. It ended